The winter had left the land scarred and quiet, as if the world itself was mourning with Thomas. His fields, once golden with wheat and bursting with life, now sat still beneath a dull sky, the earth frozen and unyielding. The farmhouse, wet, creaky, and aging, stood alone at the edge of a vast stretch of land, a solitary figure against a backdrop of gray hills and leafless trees. Wind whispered through the shutters, brushing past the broken swing on the porch that no one had sat on in months. The place felt abandoned, not in the physical sense. Thomas still lived there, but in spirit. It had been that way since his wife, Clara, passed away the previous winter. Thomas had always been a man of the land. He knew the seasons by scent, could tell the health of soil by the way it crumbled in his hand, and had once believed he would die happy right where he stood beside the woman he loved, working the farm they'd built together from the ground up. But Clara's death had broken something in him. It wasn't just her absence that haunted the house, but the echoes of the life they'd shared, her laughter as she watered the garden, her humming as she stirred the soup pot, the way she'd lean into his shoulder during quiet evenings by the fire. Every room now held a memory, and every memory was heavy. Since her passing, Thomas had spoken less and less. His neighbors tried to check in at first, bringing pies and conversation, but he'd politely declined them all. "I've got work to do," he'd say, though the truth was he didn't want to speak, not because he was angry, but because his words no longer seemed to matter. The silence had become his companion, and in that silence he found a strange sort of peace. His days were predictable, almost mechanical. He'd wake at dawn, pull on his boots, and walk the long path to the barn. He fed the animals, fixed fences, and worked the soil, even though the crops were still months from planting. It wasn't for productivity, it was to stay moving, to keep his mind from settling too long on the aching hollow in his chest. And so, on one cold morning, with frost still biting the ground and the sky heavy with the threat of more snow, Thomas moved through his chores just as he always did. He didn't expect anything to change. He didn't want anything to change. But as he rounded the chicken coop to gather eggs, something made him stop in his tracks. There, crouched low in the mud near the coop, was a figure. At first, he thought it was an animal. It moved with that same fluid, watchful energy, attention in the limbs, a readiness to bolt. But as he stepped closer, he saw the unmistakable shape of a young girl, barefoot, her skin smeared with dirt, her hair hanging in long tangled ropes that might have once been blonde. Her clothes were torn and threadbare, barely more than rags, and her knees were drawn up tightly to her chest. She didn't flinch at his approach, but she didn't speak either. She just stared. Her eyes were the thing that unsettled him most. They weren't dull with fear or desperation like most lost children he'd seen. They were sharp, alert, piercing, like the eyes of a fox, sizing up a threat. They seemed out of place in a child's face, like they'd seen more than anyone her age should have. And yet, beneath that edge, Thomas could see something else. Hunger, not just for food, but for safety, shelter, warmth. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Thomas, the farmer who'd buried his heart months ago, and the girl who looked like she'd walked out of a legend. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a piece of bread. He crouched down and extended it toward her with an open palm, saying nothing. She didn't speak either, but she took the bread. And in that silent exchange, a grieving man and a wild girl, both strangers to comfort a story neither of them expected, had begun. She tore into the bread like a starving animal, but her movements weren't clumsy or desperate. They were sharp, precise, surprisingly controlled for someone who appeared to have been living in the wild. Crumbs clung to her fingers and lips, but she paid them no mind. Her eyes, however, never left Thomas. Even as she chewed, she watched him, unblinking, measuring him. Thomas remained still, crouching nearby with a calm that surprised even himself. He had expected her to run. Children didn't usually react this way, especially not ones who looked like they hadn't been cared for in months, maybe years. But this girl didn't tremble, didn't speak, didn't cry. It was as if she'd bypassed all the usual stages of fear or trust. She was something entirely different. He studied her carefully in the growing light. Her skin was scratched in places, dotted with old scars and fresh cuts. Her bare feet were calloused and rough, as though she had been walking through forests and fields without shoes for a very long time. Her clothing was barely holding together, a thin, oversized shirt and shorts, both stained with mud and torn at the edges. Around her neck, he noticed a piece of string tied into a loose knot, but whatever had once hung from it was long gone. Thomas tried speaking again, gently. "Where did you come from?" he asked, keeping his voice low and unthreatening. "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" The girl didn't answer. Her gaze didn't shift, but something in her body relaxed just slightly, like a wild animal that had decided the man before it was not a predator. She licked her fingers clean and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Then she did something unexpected. She tilted her head, almost bird-like, and mimicked his words softly under her breath. "Help," she said, the word foreign on her tongue. Hurt. It wasn't an answer, but it wasn't nothing either. Thomas's heart tightened. There was intelligence behind those eyes. She understood. Maybe not everything, but enough. enough to know he meant no harm. Dot still crouched. He gestured toward the barn in the distance. "It's warm in there," he said. "Safe. You can rest." She didn't move. He stood slowly, never turning his back on her, and took a few steps toward the barn. Then he looked back. She was watching, silent still. Then, without a sound, she rose to her feet. Her movements were fluid, almost unnatural, closer to a wild creature than a child, but she followed him carefully, at a distance, like a shadow. Thomas didn't speak again. He walked slowly, glancing back every few seconds to make sure she was still there. When he reached the barn, he opened the door wide and stepped aside. She stopped a few feet away, sniffed the air, then padded forward on the balls of her feet. Her eyes darted around the darkened space, taking in the hay, the tools, the stalls. She hesitated at the threshold, then stepped inside. Inside the barn. The air was warmer. The animals stirred but didn't panic at the girl's presence, which surprised Thomas. She crouched near a stack of hay and curled up, not waiting for instructions. No questions, no introductions, just instinct and stillness. Thomas fetched a blanket from the house, a few extra apples and another slice of bread. When he returned, she was still in the same spot, now sitting upright, eyes alert. He placed the food gently in front of her, then handed her the blanket. She took it without a word and pulled it around her shoulders. For the first time in months, something inside Thomas shifted, not healed but stirred. This strange, wild child who hadn't even told him her name had brought something into his world that he hadn't expected. Purpose. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know where she'd come from. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't leave her alone. Word spread quickly in the village, as it always did in quiet places where routine ruled and gossip filled the silence between sunrise and sundown. By mid-morning the next day, several townsfolk had heard the same rumor, that Thomas, the widowed farmer who had barely spoken since his wife passed, had brought home a strange, wild-looking child from the woods. Some claimed she was a ghost. Others insisted she was a runaway, perhaps from a broken home in the next county. But the most dramatic whispered that she was cursed, that she had no family, no name, and had been raised by wolves in the deep forest, where no one dared to wander. Thomas heard none of it. He wasn't one for town chatter, and had rarely left the farm since Clara's funeral. He didn't seek attention or approval. His only concern was the girl now sleeping in the loft of his barn, curled in the hay, with the blanket he'd given her wrapped tightly around her small frame. She had not run away during the night, nor had she tried to steal anything. In fact, she had barely moved at all except to eat. He checked on her often, not to frighten her, but to reassure himself that she was still there, that it hadn't all been some grief-born dream conjured from loneliness. He brought her breakfast that morning: oatmeal with honey and chopped apples. Nothing fancy, but warm and filling. When he approached, she opened her eyes and sat up immediately, as alert as if she'd never truly been asleep. Again, she said nothing, but accepted the food with both hands and ate quietly, cross-legged. "In the hay, do you have a name?" Thomas asked, kneeling nearby. "Anything you want me to call you?" She stared at him, chewing slowly. Then, after a pause, she tapped her chest. "Lena," she said softly. It could have been her name, or it could have been something else, something she remembered from another life, another language. But it was something, and Thomas accepted it with a nod. "Lena," he repeated. "All right then." From that moment on, she was Lena, and though she still didn't speak more than a word or two, it was a start. Later that afternoon, Thomas went into town for supplies: flour, feed, a new pair of boots. As he walked down the main street, he could feel eyes following him from windows and storefronts. The general store clerk, Mrs. Harper, leaned over the counter as he placed his items down. "Heard you've got company," she said with a raised eyebrow. Thomas said nothing at first, then replied calmly, "She needed help." "Help," Mrs. Harper repeated. "That child's wild. George saw her yesterday, said she was barefoot in the frost. What if she's dangerous, Tom?" He met her gaze with a weariness that silenced her. "Dangerous people don't sleep in barns and eat with their hands like they've never had a hot meal." The clerk looked uncomfortable but didn't press further. Still, the questions lingered. Why was she alone? How had she survived? And more importantly, why had he taken her in? When Thomas returned to the farm that evening, he found Lena standing in the pasture, watching the horses. She had climbed over the fence with ease, quiet as a cat, light-footed and quick. The animals didn't seem afraid of her. In fact, they stood calmly as she approached, gently extending a hand toward their noses. It was the kind of ease that came not from training, but from instinct. Something in her didn't see animals as separate, but familiar, almost kin. Thomas stood in the doorway and watched. In that moment, something became clear. This girl hadn't just been abandoned. She hadn't simply lost her way. She had survived in a way few ever could. Not just physically but spiritually. She had come through something wild and untamed, and emerged with a quiet resilience that most adults would envy. The village could gossip all it wanted. Thomas didn't care. What he saw wasn't a cursed child or a wild threat. What he saw was someone like himself, grieving, lost, and searching for something she couldn't name. And he knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going anywhere. The days that followed were slow, but full of quiet revelations. Lena remained mostly silent, speaking only in short, fragmented words when absolutely necessary. But what she lacked in language, she made up for in observation. She watched Thomas closely, how he fed the animals, how he carried hay, how he repaired the broken hinge on the chicken coop door. Before long, she began copying him, sometimes without being asked. If he tossed corn to the chickens, she'd gather more. If he hauled a bucket of water to the pigs, she'd grab another. She didn't ask questions, didn't complain, just did, with an unspoken grace that surprised him. It was clear she was learning by instinct. She moved in sync with nature, not against it. Her body was agile, almost unnaturally so, and her sense of balance was remarkable. One morning, Thomas found her perched on the tallest beam of the barn, her legs dangling casually like a child on a swing. She was barefoot as always, her hair still wild and tangled. When she saw him approach, she didn't flinch or try to explain. She just smiled, a small, subtle curve of the lips, more like a private joke than a greeting. Thomas didn't scold her, he simply nodded, both impressed and concerned. "You keep climbing like that and you'll break your neck," he muttered. She didn't understand the words, perhaps, but the tone made her chuckle. A soft, short sound. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. From then on, Lena made the farm her home in ways only she could. She built small nests of blankets and straw in corners no one used, curled up like a fox to nap during the day. She collected shiny things, buttons, bits of string, polished stones, and hid them in a box she'd claimed as her own. Sometimes, she would vanish for hours into the nearby woods, only to return with bundles of herbs or a bird feather tucked behind her ear. Each time, Thomas tried not to worry. He had stopped asking where she went. He simply watched the tree line and waited. Word around the village hadn't softened. Children whispered tales of the wolf girl, daring each other to go near Thomas's farm. Adults were less playful. Some suggested calling the authorities. "That girl belongs in a hospital," one woman muttered. "Outside the post office." "Or a cage," said another, but none of them actually acted. Thomas had never given the town reason to question his judgment before. He was a quiet man, yes, but known for being fair, kind, and deeply grounded. And perhaps more than that, he was a man grieving, and they respected grief like a scar. You didn't touch it unless you had to. Still, the children remained fascinated. One afternoon, while Thomas was in town, a few wandered past the property's edge and spotted Lena chasing a fox through the orchard. She moved with animal speed, darting between trees, barefoot and laughing, her laugh more like a wild whoop than anything human. The children ran home screaming and thrilled, swearing she had talked to the fox. Whether they believed it or not didn't matter. The legend was growing. Back at the farm, Lena's world was simple. She followed rhythms: the crow of the rooster, the rising of the sun, the hush of evening. She didn't need clocks or calendars. Her body responded to light and warmth, to food and sleep. Thomas began to notice how she changed the energy of the place. The animals were calmer around her. Even the grumpy old rooster, who'd pecked at everyone else for years, let her hand feed him. She had something ancient in her, a calm wildness, untamed, but not cruel. She still didn't tell him anything about her past. Not with words, but her silence spoke volumes. The way she flinched at sudden noises. The way she never fully closed her eyes while sleeping. The way she sat with her back to the wall, always watching the doors. Thomas knew trauma when he saw it. He'd impress her. He simply gave her space. A place to be. A chance to become whoever she wanted to be now. And little by little, the space between them began to close, not with talk, but with trust. By the third week, Lena had become part of the daily rhythm on the farm. Thomas had stopped thinking of her as a visitor, or even a burden. She was simply there, like the wind, like the trees. A presence that didn't demand much, yet changed everything. She still didn't speak often, but her silences no longer felt like walls. They felt like still water, deep, reflective, full of things unsaid. One morning, Thomas found her in the garden. It had been Clara's garden once, and after she passed, he had let it go wild. Weeds tangled in the flower beds, and the soil had dried into hard clumps. But now, Lena was there, crouched over a patch of earth, her hands covered in dirt. She had pulled the weeds up carefully, not in haste but with quiet determination. Next to her were several smooth stones arranged in a spiral. She looked up as he approached, her hair falling over her face, and smiled. She loved this garden, Thomas said, more to himself than to Lena. Clara did, said it kept her sane in the hard years. Lena reached down and gently patted the soil flat again. "Flowers," she said, her voice soft, uncertain. "Grow good." It was only 2 words, but they landed like a song. Something in his chest tightened, and for a moment, Thomas felt like he wasn't just hearing her speak, he was watching her bloom, slowly, in the sunlight of safety. That day, they worked side by side. He handed her seeds, showed her how to turn the earth. She listened closely, mimicking his every motion with care. She had an uncanny ability to absorb information without needing much explanation. She wasn't like a child learning. She was like someone remembering. As spring unfolded across the hills, Lena changed with it. Her hair was still wild, but cleaner. Now, she began wearing boots and old coats Thomas found for her. She learned to make simple meals, to wash clothes, to help mend fences. And though she never told him what had happened to her, where she came from, or how long she had lived in the woods, he stopped needing to know. She was here. That was enough. Still, the questions lingered. There were nights when Thomas would glance out the window and see her standing motionless in the field, staring at the sky as if waiting for something. There were moments when she would jump at distant howls or pace along the edge of the forest with a restlessness that reminded him of a caged animal. And then there were the dreams. Thomas began waking in the middle of the night to sounds soft, whimpers not quite human, coming from the barn loft. He'd creep in quietly and find her curled under the blanket, fists clenched, brow furrowed, whispering in a language he didn't recognize. Sometimes she growled in her sleep, low and deep in her throat, like an animal protecting its den. Other times she cried out, clawing at the air. But when he approached, she always calmed. She never remembered the dreams or said she didn't, but the fear lingered in her eyes the next morning. Thomas wanted to ask. So many times, he wanted to break through the silence and say, "What happened to you out there?" But something told him not to. Whatever had shaped her had also taught her to protect herself, to stay silent, to survive. He would not rip open wounds. That had only just begun to scar. So instead, he offered stability. He taught her how to read simple words, how to measure grain, how to hammer nails and tie knots. He gave her structure, and she, in return, gave him purpose. In the quiet hours, he began talking again, not because she demanded it, but because her presence made space for it. He told her about Clara, about the long winters and good harvests, about the way the land had healed him once before. And slowly, without realizing it, he began to heal again. Lena never became chatty, never completely domesticated. She remained a mystery, wrapped in quiet strength and primal instinct. But she laughed more often now, smiled. Sometimes she even sang strange little melodies with no words, like lullabies from another world. And in the evenings, when the sun sank low and the wind whispered through the fields, Thomas would sit on the porch and listen. And he knew without a doubt that whatever darkness Lena had come from, she was stepping into the light now. With him. It was a rainy morning when the world beyond the farm came knocking. The clouds hung low, smearing the hills in gray mist, and the soft patter of rain played against the windows like an old lullaby. Thomas was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, eggs, toast, and coffee, when he heard the sound of tires crunching gravel on the drive. It was rare for anyone to visit unannounced. The farm was off the main road, nestled between two hills, and the only ones who ever came were deliverymen or the occasional neighbor. But this vehicle was different, a dark SUV with government plates and tinted windows. Thomas stepped onto the porch just as two people emerged, a man in a beige windbreaker and a woman in a charcoal gray coat, both holding folders and clipboards, their expressions stiff with formality. "Mr. Thomas Redding?" the woman asked, her voice firm but polite. "Yes, we're with Child Protective Services. May we speak with you for a moment?" Thomas felt the world shift under his feet. He glanced toward the barn instinctively, heart hammering. Lena was out there, probably still asleep in the loft, wrapped in her blanket and dreaming of something far from this. "We've received reports," the man added, "of a minor possibly abandoned living on this property." Thomas didn't answer immediately. He'd known this moment might come. Since the day Lena first walked barefoot onto his land, he'd known something about it wasn't going to stay quiet forever. But knowing and being ready were two very different things. "She's not a threat," he said quietly. "She's just a child. We'd still like to speak with her," the woman replied, "and with you." He led them inside, offered coffee, though neither accepted. They asked questions, how long Lena had been there, what he knew about her background, whether he'd tried to contact law enforcement. He answered as honestly as he could. He told them the truth. He'd found her in the woods, alone, hungry, silent, no name, no belongings, no clue where she came from. "She calls herself Lena," he said. "That's all I know. And she's not some lost pet, or a case file. She's a person. She's healing." The woman's eyes softened slightly, but her voice remained official. "You understand, Mr. Redding, we're not here to take her away without cause. But if she's been neglected or harmed in the past, we need to ensure she's safe now. For her sake." As if summoned by their voices, Lena appeared in the doorway. She was barefoot again, her hair damp from the rain, a puzzled look on her face as she scanned the room. Her gaze landed on the strangers, and immediately, her entire posture changed. Her eyes narrowed, her hands clenched. She didn't speak, but her breathing grew sharp, almost audible. Thomas stood. "It's all right, Lena, they're just here to ask questions." But she backed up a step, then another. Her body tensed like a bowstring. The visitors rose slowly, adopting a non-threatening posture. "Lena," the man said gently, "it's okay, we just want to talk." Lena didn't run, but she didn't come inside either. Her eyes flicked toward Thomas, questioning, uncertain. "It's your choice," he said softly, "but you're safe here, I promise." After a long moment, she stepped forward only a little and sat on the edge of the porch. The woman approached slowly, crouching nearby. She didn't ask the usual questions. Instead, she offered her name, then waited. No clipboard, no pen, just presence. Eventually, Lena whispered, "Don't want to go." "We're not taking you," the woman assured her. "Not unless we have to." Thomas watched it unfold in silence. The fear, the trust, the possibility. He realized then that no matter how much he wanted to keep Lena safe, there was a world outside his farm that might come knocking again. And maybe someday, Lena would need more than quiet fields and kindness. Maybe she'd need answers. But for now, she was still here, still choosing to stay. And that, he thought, was enough. The visit from the officials left an invisible ripple across the farm, one that neither Thomas nor Lena could ignore, even if they didn't speak of it. After the black SUV rolled down the gravel road and disappeared into the mist, a strange quiet settled in. It wasn't the usual calm of country life, but something heavier, as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting. That evening, Thomas sat by the fire, rubbing the ache in his knees, listening to the soft crackle of the flames. Lena was across the room, seated cross-legged on the rug, her hands carefully threading bits of colored string into a crude bracelet. She'd started making them after finding a bundle of old yarn in the attic, bright blues, faded reds, forest greens. At first, she'd simply twisted them together and left them lying in windowsills, on fence posts, tucked into the branches of the orchard trees. But lately, she began giving them to Thomas, not with ceremony, but quietly, setting one down beside his mug or leaving one draped across the back of his chair. He never asked why. He simply wore them. Tonight, though, her hands were slower, less sure. The tension in her shoulders hadn't eased since the strangers came. Every so often, she would glance at the window, as if half expecting headlights to return, to take her away from the fragile world she had just begun to trust. "You're not leaving," Thomas said gently, not even looking up from the fire. "Not unless you want to." Lena didn't respond at first, but then she whispered, "They don't believe I'm okay. They don't know you're okay." "That's different." He turned to look at her, "But they saw something today. How strong you are, how much you've grown. That matters." She looked down at the bracelet, frowning slightly, and said, "What if they come back?" "They might," he said honestly. "They're doing their job, and they'll want to make sure I'm doing mine." "You're not my father," she murmured, but there was no anger in her voice, just a soft, heavy truth. Thomas nodded. "No, I'm not. But I care for you like a father would." She looked at him then, her eyes wide and searching, as if weighing those words against everything she had known before. And then, quietly, she crawled closer to the hearth and placed the half-finished bracelet on his knee. "For you," she whispered, "so you don't forget." Thomas took the bracelet, rough and tangled but warm with meaning, and slipped it onto his wrist beside the others. "I won't," he said. That night, she didn't return to the barn. Instead, she curled up on the old sofa beside the fire, wrapped in a quilt Thomas had found in the cedar chest. He let her be, and when the wind howled through the trees outside, he watched her sleep not like a child anymore, but like someone claiming a piece of peace she had never known. In the days that followed, Lena began to open up, bit by bit, like petals in spring. She still didn't speak much, but her expressions became clearer, her trust more visible. She asked to learn how to write, pointing at the labels in the kitchen and the pencil stub Thomas used for keeping farm ledgers. So he began teaching her, one letter at a time. A for apple, B for barn, C for Clara. She stumbled, at first, frustrated by her hands, but eventually started writing her name in the dirt outside with a stick over and over again, like it mattered to see it there. She even began drawing, sketching wolves, trees, moons, firelight. One afternoon, she handed Thomas a page from the back of an old notebook. On it, a small girl sat on a hill beneath a crescent moon. Beside her was a tall figure in a wide hat, holding a lantern. He didn't ask what it meant. He didn't need to. That picture stayed on the fridge, pinned beneath a magnet shaped like a horse, and for the first time in a long while for both of them, something that looked like family began to take shape. Not built from blood or law, but from choice, from care, from the quiet promise that even the lost can find home again. Summer arrived gently that year, as if the land itself understood that the people on this farm had been through enough. The winds softened, the skies turned a bright, endless blue, and the fields swayed with golden warmth. With each passing day, Lena's laughter became less rare, her footsteps less guarded. There were moments, small ones, that Thomas would catch her humming under her breath, swinging her legs off the porch as she braided wildflowers into her hair, eyes closed against the sun. But the past, as it often does, never disappeared entirely. One evening, just after the fireflies began their slow dance across the grass, Thomas found Lena sitting at the edge of the orchard, staring into the tree line. Her knees were pulled to her chest, her eyes fixed on something invisible, far away. He sat beside her in silence. "I remember things now," she said quietly, without looking at him. Not all, but flashes. He didn't speak. He just waited. I was very small, she continued. I think my parents, they were gone. I don't know how. I only remember the forest and the howling. The way they watched over me. The wolves. Thomas turned slightly, but he didn't interrupt. They didn't hurt me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I think they protected me, like I was one of them. I was cold sometimes, and hungry. But I was never afraid. Not really. He let out a slow breath. You don't have to explain it to me. I want to, she replied, because I think if I don't tell someone, maybe it disappears. And I don't want that part of me to vanish. Even if it was strange. Thomas nodded. Sometimes the strangest parts of us are the ones worth keeping. Lena smiled faintly and picked a blade of grass, twisting it between her fingers. Do you think that's why they found me? The people in the car. Because I don't belong here. You belong wherever you're loved, Thomas said firmly. And you are. You always will be. She leaned her head on his shoulder, not something she'd ever done before. For a long time, they sat in silence, watching the last light drain from the sky. Days passed. Then weeks. The government officials returned once, not with warnings or threats, but with questions, soft ones. The woman in gray had brought a counselor, and together they sat with Lena beneath the oak tree near the barn. Lena answered some of their questions. Others she left hanging in the air like fog, but they never pushed her. They saw what Thomas already knew. She wasn't a typical case. She didn't need a new place. She had one. Eventually, the case was closed. Officially, unofficially. The social worker still called once a month to check in, but it became more of a formality, a small thread, tying Lena to the world beyond the fields, just in case. By the end of summer, the girl who had once crouched in the barn like a cornered animal now ran through the fields with a dog Thomas had adopted just for her, a scruffy mutt with a crooked tail she named Echo. She began painting the barn with bright handprints, lining the doorframe with each color of the rainbow. She helped harvest carrots, baked cornbread, and started carving small wooden animals with an old pocket knife. The darkness didn't vanish. She still woke from time to time in a cold sweat, still paused at unexpected noises, still had moments where her eyes grew distant, lost in memories that were both her own and not. But she was healing, in her own way, in her own time, and so was Thomas. On the anniversary of Clara's passing, he found Lena in the garden, laying fresh petals on the old stone he had carved in his wife's memory. She looked up and said she would have liked the flowers. He smiled, his eyes misting. Yes, she would have liked you too. Lena took his hand, and in that moment, surrounded by green hills, blooming wildflowers, and the golden hush of late afternoon, there was nothing left to say. She was no longer a mystery. She was home.